Welcome back to Myth Vision. Dr. Bart Ehrman. I'm looking forward to this course that you have, The Unknown Gospel. Can you tell us a little bit about this course that you're doing soon?
Yeah, it's actually called The Unknown Jesus, which is even worse. Because, I call it The Unknown Jesus because it's the course is about Mark, the Gospel of Mark, 8-lecture course. Dealing with a lot of the intricacies of Mark, which is it's my favorite gospel. I really like the Gospel of Mark, and I'm calling it the Unknown Jesus because it's a striking feature of Mark's gospel. That he wants to proclaim that Jesus is the Messiah. And he tries to show Jesus the Messiah, tries to show how he's the Messiah. And Mark has this distinctive thing that nobody knows it in the gospel. Jesus is an unknown Messiah, and you don't expect that. And people don't see it. People don't see it because they know the other gospels and they know what the other gospels say, and the other gospels don't do this. Mark does it. Jesus, nobody can figure out Jesus in Mark, and so it makes it really interesting.
This is a very important point that I'm learning more and more. I mean, I've heard it, but it's like almost like epiphanies. When you hear something and then it finally really dawns on you, there's an entanglement that happens with these later gospels on understanding Mark and how do we read Mark as Mark. You're going to be doing that in this course, and I hope people will tune in. I want to talk about a big issue with this because we're not just reading a gospel, we're also misunderstanding Mark's Jesus, which is a very important point of your course. Yeah. And so I want to ask, if you don't mind, can you give me maybe 3 points of evidence that suggest why the consensus scholarship says Mark in priority? That means the Gospel of Mark, for those who are watching, is the very first gospel among all the gospels.
Yeah, so Mark in priority. Mark is prior to the others, and that's usually said specifically about about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those three, the synoptic gospels. It's prior to John too, but the issue of Mark in priority is that Matthew and Luke both used Mark if it was prior. These three gospels have so many commonalities. They tell a lot of the same stories. Almost all of Mark is in Matthew, and most of it's in Luke. And sometimes they're always almost always in the same sequence and the same words. And so somebody's copying somebody. And so that's how you get these commonalities, is because somebody's copying somebody. And if Mark is prior, then Matthew and Luke have both copied Mark. And so there are reasons for thinking all of that. But the point is, if they copied it, they've also changed it. And so you can see how they've changed it to see what they're trying to emphasize. And so you really have to emphasize, if Mark is prior, it ends up mattering, because then you can see how it gets changed. Your question is, why? What makes you think so? And so the idea that Mark is prior has been the dominant view, by far the dominant view, since the 19th century, since scholars started working seriously. They started working seriously on the synoptic issue back in the 18th century, but in the 19th century, they established that Mark was prior for a variety of reasons. Some of the reasons are kind of complicated. It'd take a while. I should probably do a whole course on this problem. But part of the issue is that when you've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they often tell the same stories, and often it's the same wording. Sometimes Matthew will have something different from Mark and Luke, but Mark and Luke will agree. And sometimes Luke will have something different from Matthew and Mark, but Matthew and Mark will agree. And so you've got Matthew, Mark, and sometimes all three of them are different, and sometimes all three are the same. What you almost never get is where Matthew and Luke are agreeing against Mark. And so, in other words, where they both have something and Mark has something else. So it takes a while to explain it, but what that shows is that they're both copying Mark. Because if they're both copying Mark, sometimes all three get the same thing. Sometimes they both change things in different ways, so they get different things. Sometimes Matthew will change something and Luke won't, so Mark and Luke agree. Sometimes Luke will change something and Mark doesn't, so Mark. So like if you work it out, Mark's got to be the one they're copying, and not the other way, not some other way around. So that's one thing. Another thing is Mark has a number of passages that are found in Matthew and Luke that both of them change in some way, but in different ways, where like there's this awkward statement, like a weird phrase, or sometimes they'll change it the same way. Like Mark will say something, they'll both say, wow, that's a little bit weird. And so they'll both take it out. As an example for that, when the rich young man asked Jesus which commandments he has to keep in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, Jesus says, "Well, yeah, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't bear false witness, and don't defraud." Don't defraud. Wait, they ain't one of the 10 commandments. Both Matthew and Luke drop it. You see, so what's happening is it looks like they're both trying to improve Mark grammatically and in terms of some of the content, and so that's another reason for thinking that they both copied Mark. And so anyway, when scholars work on the synoptic problem, the synoptic problem is how you have these three so much alike and yet having differences. Mark and priority is almost always is the way they go.
Thank you for that. I'm sure there's so much more and we just don't have the time to cover, but I think it's important emphasizing this because my goal with this video is to kind of highlight the evangelical fundamentalist approach really gets smashed, just to be frank, when we take a very careful approach, a critical approach in trying to understand Mark as Mark. What I mean is one can do interpretations later, but if we're being honest with Mark's gospel and we see it as first, how we understand Jesus in Mark, how we understand the message of Mark, the teaching of the gospel, what's going on, all of that gets impacted, if that makes sense. It has an impact when we're looking at it this way. So the ending of Mark ends obviously tragic. The women were afraid and told no one. And there seems to be these added additions to the ending of Mark. Does that play any role in the scholarship's mind of why Mark may have come first? I mean, obviously it ends abruptly, but having all these additional that don't even agree with endings, doesn't that also imply that like, hey, as early as we can possibly go back, there was no ending, and they want to make it fit with the later Gospels? Yeah.
So as you're right. When Mark, a lot of people say, a lot of people on the kind of more skeptical side of reading things say that Mark doesn't have a resurrection narrative. I hear that a lot, and it's not true. Mark does have a resurrection narrative. The women go to the tomb after Jesus has been buried. They go on the third day, and the tomb's empty. A young man there tells them that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and they're supposed to go tell the disciples that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. And then, as you said, it's verse 8 of chapter 16 says, and the women fled from the tomb, and they didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid. Boom, and and so Jesus is definitely raised. There's a resurrection narrative. What there's not are appearances of Jesus to the disciples afterwards. But you get that in Matthew and Luke and John. And so I would not say that that's necessarily an argument for Mark in priority, because you could say, well, actually, he thought it'd be more stunning if they didn't tell anybody, so he changed the ending. It doesn't say that it's prior, but it does say, oh man, is that different? Because in Matthew, so the women don't tell anything to anyone. They're afraid. In Matthew, they go off and tell the disciples, and the disciples go up to Galilee and they meet Jesus there. It's just the opposite. People say, well, Mark means they didn't tell him. They didn't tell them right away. Oh, I mean, that isn't how it works. If I say to you, Derek, so Derek, you've shared a personal secret to me, and and your friend John 2 weeks later comes up to you and says, oh yeah, I heard this about you. Then you say, Bart, you said you didn't tell anyone, and I say, oh, I did not tell anyone, for the first 10 minutes. You don't say it that way. But Mark says they didn't tell anyone. And in Matthew, they tell. And of course, in the others, they also. And so, so it's different. And that's the main thing. If you don't read Mark for what Mark is saying, you completely miss it. You miss his point everywhere if you think he's saying the same thing as Matthew or John or Luke or whatever.
And just to emphasize your point, what I was, I guess, getting at is maybe it's common sense. I don't know. But like It's kind of in that dissimilarity argument of embarrassment kind of approach that makes you wonder this one would be prior. Like whatever the example may be, it seems like there's a way of correcting this Mark version. And most scholars kind of see that in the material, like, oh, we got to have him tell everybody. I mean, how's the gospel out here? How's Christianity exist? Mark doesn't really give us that. Let's fix it. Is that a thrust of an argument for Mark and priority that a lot of scholars use in Mark and then comparing it to Matthew and Luke?
They tend not to use that argument about the ending. And it's because they can. I mean, you could make an argument. You could make that as an argument. But I think the counter to it is that you can have people come up with weird things because they think it's striking. Because the deal is that Mark knows that Jesus appeared to the disciples in Galilee. He has that tradition. Because he tells the women, go tell the disciples to go to Galilee. That seems to presuppose that he knows Jesus is going to see the disciples in Galilee, as he does in Matthew. So I think Mark knows the tradition, but he doesn't want to say it because he wants it to end with the secrecy that nobody knows. So I think. Look, I mean, I think it is more likely that Mark's ending where they didn't tell anybody is the first one, and that Matthew thought, "Oh my God, are you kidding me?" And then Matthew has them telling them, and they go up. And so I do think that's more plausible, but I don't think it's a cut and dried case because I think Mark had to know that the disciples found out, and yet he nonetheless ends a story without them finding out. So it doesn't work as history. It does not work as history because you can't say the women really never told anybody historically, because then how would Mark know? How would he know? But you could imagine somebody crafting a story that way, in my opinion.
Appreciate that. I want to ask you about the cognitive dissonance question, because nobody gets it, right? All the Jews are expecting a certain kind of Messiah. Second Temple Judaism, I've had a lot of academics on recently that just kind of express this about the end of, like, a timeline in history is going to end. There seems to be a much more deterministic approach. Mark is emphasizing a soon near end of all things, historically speaking, where God will come in and set the record straight, remove the enemies, Rome, you name it. The question is, the secret, so to speak, which you're going to emphasize and highlight in your course, is that his death, him actually dying, is that's why he's the Messiah. And in fact, Paul and his Philippians, him, and of course, Romans 1:4 kind of emphasizes by the resurrection, even though it looks like Mark might be adoptionist. Either way, the point I'm getting at and trying to get your thoughts is, do you think that cognitive dissonance best explains that, oh, well, he's the Messiah because we're going to find scriptures, Isaiah 53, suffering servant, my God, why have you forsaken me? This helps highlight why he's the Messiah rather than why he didn't come like all the Jews expected a Messiah to come like.
I think that, so for people who don't know, I mean, cognitive dissonance is this theory that was developed by social psychologists, especially in the 1950s, to explain what happens when people have a very firm expectation of something that's going to happen. They have a very firm expectation that is theoretically able to be shown wrong. and that it's got to be something that's specific enough you could see that, yeah, that was wrong. And then it turns out that it is wrong. And cognitive dissonance is what happens in their heads once they realize that this thing they were really committed to is completely wrong. And what it says is then they come up with ways of explaining it away. And so this is what you're saying, is that Jesus, the disciple, so I think we're talking about historically now. We're talking about like Jesus himself in history, that Jesus' disciples during his lifetime expected that he might be the Messiah or that he was the Messiah. And they had expectations of the Messiah the Jews had of the Messiah, which is he was this powerful figure who destroyed the enemy and set up, Israel as a sovereign state, or so he overcomes the enemy, destroys the enemy. And then they have that expectation, and that could be disconfirmed. And it was disconfirmed in a rather cruel way. Instead of being enthroned as king, Jesus was crucified. And it completely, I mean, you talk about disconfirmation. Oh my God. We thought he was going to overthrow the Romans, and they squashed him like a mosquito. And so The idea then is that they've got to have some way of reconciling that in their heads to make sense of what they used to think. And so there's a scholar who's written a book about this. I don't know if your viewers will know this book by John Gager called Kingdom and Community. It was written back in the 1970s. But he argues on the basis, he explains how social psychologists develop their theories of cognitive dissonance, and then he applies it to the Jesus traditions. And he says that this was a moment where cognitive dissonance did kick in at the crucifixion. My view of this is that, I think that's absolutely right. They were trying, oh my God, how did this happen? But then they came to believe that Jesus got raised from the dead. And you could argue that that was a result of cognitive dissonance, that this is the way they dealt with the fact that they were wrong. They came up with a new way of being right. Or you could say, some of them just honestly thought they saw something, or they mistaken identity. You could come up with all sorts of theories. But I think what happens is once they think that Jesus was raised from the dead, then they start thinking, what we were wrong about is what kind of Messiah he would be. We weren't wrong about the main point. The main point is he was the Messiah. But now I see he was the kind of Messiah who had to die. And so that's I think, and that's the beginning of Christianity. In some ways, Jesus himself is not the beginning of Christianity. I mean, his preachings were not about having faith in his death and resurrection. So Christianity begins when they start thinking he was this other kind of Messiah who had to die for the sins of the world.
This is a fantastic point to bring up that you have changed your mind on over the decades of your research, and that is the legendary empty tomb. Mark, is the first story, and especially since we're already assuming this is the first gospel, which I can't wait for you to do a course on just breaking that down. So here you have the first narrative of an empty tomb, and I'm with you. I totally see a resurrection happening here. It doesn't narrate appearances, but I'm with you on that. Now, this empty tomb, if you don't mind, can you give us a few reasons why you say this is legend? And then I want to get into another scholar who has a really well-known quote. I'm sure you are aware of his work.
So I'll say that, virtually, I'm not going to be talking about this particular point in my course. The things I'm going to be doing in my course are things that historical scholars are not going to have a problem with. They'll disagree with this, that, and the other thing, but they're not going to. But this is a view that I have that is not a majority view among historical scholars at all. But it is my view that the empty tomb is a legend, that it's not, that they did not discover, that Jesus' tomb was not discovered empty on the third day. I think it's legendary. The main reason for thinking it's legendary, I didn't come up with this, by the way. It's John Dominic Crossan has been arguing this for decades, and I always thought it was a bit loony. I thought, man, that's crazy, because Crossan comes out and says he thinks Jesus' body got eaten by dogs, and it's like, whoa, come on, that's a bit extreme. And I like everybody else in the guild, I said, yeah, no, that's crazy. But then what I did is I decided to take it seriously about 10 years ago. And I read every reference I could find in every Roman author or Greek author about crucifixion, especially Roman authors, but sometimes writing in Greek, about what Romans did with crucifixion. And one of the kind of consistent motifs, nobody describes the process of crucifixion. They don't describe actually how they do it, unfortunately, because we'd love to know. But and so people have assumptions about how they did it, but we don't. But they do sometimes talk about what happens after the person dies. And what they say in every case is that the person was left on the cross to begin to deteriorate on the cross, to rot on the cross, and to be eaten by scavengers. And so this was part of the punishment. The Romans wanted to show that you not just they would torture you to death, they'd leave your corpse to be desecrated. And people hated that in the ancient world. And people today wouldn't like it much. But in the ancient world, this was horrifying, that your corpse would not be given a proper burial. But that's part of the punishment. You don't get a proper burial. So I don't think they made an exception in the case of Jesus. Certainly not because he was the Son of God. People think Jesus was exceptional. And of course, he was. I mean, there are 2 billion people who worship him today, but he wasn't exceptional in the eyes of the Romans, and they killed him the way they killed other criminals against the state. They crucified him, and so I think they just left him on the cross. The idea of Joseph of Arimathea burying him, you get it in all 4 Gospels. We don't know of this person otherwise. He's from Arimathea. We don't know of a town called Arimathea at the time. There are the accounts themselves certainly have odds. They're at odds with each other in some ways. But I think that my basic view is that the Romans didn't treat Jesus differently from anyone else, and they left him on the cross. And people say, yeah, well, Jews didn't allow that to happen, though. They had to bury them the next day. Yeah, if you were killed by a Jewish authority, you had to be buried that day. But Romans didn't give a damn about what the Jews' policies were. Oh, but they wouldn't want to riot. They don't want to upset. Are you kidding me? Why do you think they're crucifying people? They love getting you ticked off at them. That they're crucifying you and doing this to show you better not rebel. And if you do rebel, this is what will happen to you. And so I just don't think that Jesus was buried that day. I don't think he was buried on the day he died. I don't think it happened in the Roman world.
Just to add to that, is it also a common theme that divine men were, there was empty tombs? Do you think that the Mediterranean concept of empty tomb playing a role in this narrative also just helps account for that? Like Robin Faith Walsh, I asked this recently, and she said, yeah, I think that an empty tomb is a signal, or kind of like a motif you would imagine in the Mediterranean world, for someone becoming a god.
Well, it's an interesting point, and I don't know of other empty tomb narratives per se, and I don't know if she's referring to something specific about an empty tomb. What is the proof is that the body's no longer here. And so you get that going back in Greek and Roman legend. And for example, Romulus is kind of a key point, because everybody knew the story of Romulus. And the story was that their troops were marshaled in front of him. They were having this big military parade, and and he's sitting on the stand, and the senators are all around him watching the troops go by. And then the storm comes up and gets dark, and fog comes down. There's lightning and thunder. You can't see anything. And finally the storm lifts, and Romulus ain't there. And so there were two stories about it. One story was that the senators took the opportunity and ripped him to shreds in the parts of his body because they didn't like him ruling over them. But the other story that the senators swore to was that he had been taken up and been made a god. And their evidence was he's not here. And there was a man who said, oh, yes, he appeared to me later and he talked with me and he explained to me what had happened. And then Romulus becomes the god Quirinus because and the evidence is he's not here. So when somebody's not there, well, where are they? And anybody who's taken up to heaven is made a divine being. So Robin may have meant that. I don't know, or maybe she knows about empty tombs that I don't know about, and that's entirely possible.
Yeah, she is in the classicist vein, so I'm sure she's read things. You know how it is. I would. Yeah,
but I mean, I read the classics too.
Right. I'm just saying. Maybe
I'm wondering I don't know what she would have in mind.
Gotcha. I'll have to get her to emphasize that. Here's a quotation. My good friend Derek Bennett did a recent response to, but he used this quote. I'm just going to give you this. The important point is that in the primitive preaching, resurrection and exaltation belong together as two sides of one coin. Hence the designation resurrection exaltation, and that it implies a geographic transfer from earth to heaven. Hence, it is possible to say that in the primitive kerygma, resurrection is resurrection to heaven. To summarize, the general conviction in the earliest Christian preaching is that as of the day of his resurrection, Jesus was in heaven, seated at the right hand of God. Resurrection and exaltation were regarded as two sides of one coin. Resurrection meant resurrection to heaven or resurrection from grave to glory. A.W. Zweep, the Ascension of Messiah in Luke and Christology. That those later Gospels want to give him more earthly time of like spending time with the disciples, and even John wants to say, "Hey, don't touch me, I haven't gone up yet." In Mark, it seems he goes from the grave up. Are you in agreement that this is like grave up to heaven, or do you think he has a sojourn before he actually goes up? I mean, it doesn't really tell us, but Paul seems to have from grave up.
I agree with his view that the earliest Christians thought that it's from the grave up, and I think that they thought being raised from the dead does not mean you kind of hang around for 40 days or something like that. They didn't. The earliest Christians thought that the resurrection was also the exaltation. When he refers, he sounds like he's referring to a term, resurrection, exaltation, as a single term. And of course, that's not in the Bible or anywhere. I think that's a modern term that so it sounds like he's saying, that's why people called it that. Well, I don't know that anybody called it that, but that they didn't have to, because that's what the idea meant. The resurrection wasn't a revivification of a corpse. It was a deification, and so that happens when you go up. So I agree with that. The problem is that our authors, of course, were living. Our earliest author is Paul, and he's writing a couple decades after the event, and Mark is probably writing about 4 decades after the event. And I'm not sure that either one of them has that view. The reason I hesitate on Mark is because Mark says that they're to go to Galilee because Jesus will appear to them there. Now, it may mean that Jesus has gone up and he's going to come back down to see you. It could be that. And maybe that's what Paul thinks too. But he clearly says that he was raised on the third day and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. And so it doesn't sound like he's going up and down. You could argue that he's going up and down because Paul does say that then last of all, he appeared to me. And he seems to be assuming that it's in the same way as he appeared to the others. Well, Paul's is 2 or 3 years later, so it clearly wasn't the same. Jesus wasn't hanging around until then, and so maybe Paul does think that he's going up and down. That's a good question, and maybe Mark does too. The one thing that I'll say is that in the Gospel of John does assume that it's going to be back on earth and then ascend. The only actual reference to an ascension, literal, like of it happening, is in the book of Acts. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't narrate an ascension. And so what is often thought is that Jesus died. His disciples thought he got raised from the dead, which meant that he was taken all the way up. Then one of the evidence of the resurrection was the appearances. And so they started thinking, well, he was around for a while before he went up. Luke has him around for 40 days, and then he goes up, and then Luke narrates him going up. It is interesting, though, that that's in the book of Acts. In the Gospel of Luke, written by the same guy, Jesus meets the disciples on the day he gets raised from the dead. And then he goes up that day. And so Luke appears to have both traditions. Even though in the Gospel of Luke, he doesn't go straight up, though. He spends a few hours on earth. He goes to the road of Emmaus and he meets some people. Then he goes, but it's the same day at least. So I think that's a kind of moving toward the idea that he's around for a while.
I think it's fair to say that if you're an evangelical fundamentalist, you might want to sign up for the course and check out what Dr. Bart D. Ehrman has to say. And not because he's interested in deconverting you. I have no quarrels either with people who believe. In fact, my goal is to, just like you, Dr. Ehrman, have people become more educated. I think it will reduce harm in the long run for some of the beliefs I do find within some of these circles. So I hope that we can get people to come sign up if you want. Again, why should people sign up?
Well, it's not a course for any particular religious persuasion. I mean, this is a course, an 8-lecture course on one of the most important pieces of literature in our civilization that almost very few people really understand what's going in the Gospel of Mark. Historian scholars, biblical scholars, have studied it intensely, and it turns out it's just a really interesting book. For me, I may have said this already. It's my favorite gospel of the New Testament. It's my favorite book, probably my favorite book of the Bible, because it is genius in ways that people just don't see until it gets pointed out to them. And so I'll be talking about the distinctive message of Mark and why it's really interesting and what it's the unexpected themes in it, and talking about things like how scribes changed the story in places. And I'll have a couple lectures on that, and on how, it turns out to be a different gospel if you change the story, change the words in places, and all that. So it's going to be informative. It's not going to be trying to persuade anybody of a particular religious view, but it will be significant to anybody, whether they're a believer or not.